Cleopatra and Mark Antony met in Turkey, in a town pretty near the Syrian border, not far from the coast, in the town of Tarsus. And I suppose the only other thing of any historical significance at all about that town is it was also the birthplace of the Apostle Paul. He was born, as you know, to the name Saul, and he was born a child of privilege. But he was also a child born into three different cultures. His father was a Roman citizen. Only 10% of the population Roman citizens, but his father obviously had enough clout. A man of some importance, he was one of the ones made a Roman citizen. So when Saul was born, he was also a citizen of Rome. This comes up later. You know, he has access to Caesar in his trial. He has greater access to the Gentile community because of this. It's important. But growing up in Tarsus, he also grew up Greek. Since the conquest of Alexander the Great a few centuries earlier, Greek was established as the first international language, which allowed people from different cultures to trade and do commerce with each other. And so Paul was not only a Roman citizen, but he was also very much at home in the Greek and Hellenistic world of Asia Minor. But he was also a Jew. Saul was raised in the home of a Pharisee. His worldview, his political awareness, his theology, all shaped by the religious orientation of a Pharisee. And by his own admission, he took to it. At age 13, the family, remember they had plenty of money, they let him move out, go live with his aunt for a while out of town in Jerusalem so he could study with the great Rabbi Gamaliel. And he was tough. Saul took to this religious Judaism, this Phariseeism. He was driven and self-righteous and intolerant of anybody who didn't share his religious tradition. In fact, Paul says later of himself, I was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He was into this stuff. As you know, the Pharisees don't fare too well in the New Testament. But most of them were sincere, pious people who took the faith seriously. They wanted the faith untarnished, unchallenged. But Saul was one of the radicals. He was one of the most ardent of the group. He is one of the ones who got especially heated, especially red-faced, when this group within Judaism went around proclaiming that a carpenter from Nazareth was the Messiah. Really? A carpenter from Nazareth. Has any good come out of Nazareth? They were making the most outrageous claim. They were claiming that he had been raised from the dead. And fine, but this little group of radicals soon turned into a movement. And now more and more people were coming to believe this, and so Saul and some of the other zealots were committed to ridding Judaism of this heretical threat. They were going after him. When the group captured the Christ follower named Stephen and accused him of prophesying against the temple and stoned him to death, Saul was right there, grinning and approving. And then he learned through some connections that a large group of the Christ disciples were seeking exile in Damascus, 136 miles north of Jerusalem. And if you're going after a group, a good fisherman goes to where the fish are. He got up another band of radicals. They packed their bags and started on a trip north. They were going to get them. And now we're at today's story, Acts chapter 9. Meanwhile, Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. By the way, this is the first time this group has ever been given a name, an identifier. They're called the Way. In fact, they're not even called Christians yet. As you know, Christian is the term that kind of weathers the test of time. Later, they're called Christians more universally. But first, they were called the Way. And it was not meant to be a compliment. It was meant to be unflattering. This group follows the Way. It was said as kind of a scoff or a slur. They were called the Way because they were living a particular manner of life. These people were believers in Jesus, but more, their belief affected the way they lived, and it made them stand out. J. Edwin Orr, a once popular evangelist, used to speak to college students as a part of his ministry. And he did this same thing over and over at different colleges all over. He would, as a part of his lecture, his talk, his sermon, he would find some young, innocent-looking college female, ask her to stand up, and he'd say, "Do you believe in marriage?" She'd say, "Yes." Then he'd say, "Why?" Well, she'd stumble around and do some combination of, it's a good context for raising children, or helps offer some promise that life might not be as lonely, or a stable institution for committed relationship, whatever. And then Dr. Orr would declare, "You are married." She would say, "No, not even close." Different women, different answers, but something like, "I don't even have a boyfriend," or "We've just started dating," but they would say, "I am nowhere close to making that kind of commitment." And then Dr. Orr would say, "Exactly. It's not enough to believe. You have to make a commitment, and there has to be somebody to whom you make that commitment." These early Christians did not just believe. They reordered their lives around their commitment to Jesus Christ. They were identified as Christians, but not because they had a church membership or a fish magnet on the back of their Audi. Not one of them had a t-shirt they had ordered from witnesswear.com. They were identified as Christ followers because they lived a way. They lived a way that was different. Well, the only lead all the persecutors had to go on to identify this band who are not wearing t-shirts, not wearing bracelets. The only thing they had to identify which one of the Jews were a part of this group were whether or not they lived this peculiar, particular way. We don't use that phrase much anymore. As I said, that's kind of gone out of vogue. But if you listen closely, you can catch echoes of it. If you hear somebody say of somebody else, "Now there goes a real Christian," you can be guaranteed they're not talking about his church membership or even his orthodoxy. They're noting that he has a manner of life that is different. He follows the way. If somebody says, "She is one of the most Christ-like people I have ever known," they're talking about a quality that's developed internally through the life of prayer. They're talking about somebody with a singular commitment to Jesus Christ that shows the marks of kindness and blessing and generosity. Somebody who follows the way. So Saul is en route to Damascus to find those, to arrest those who live this peculiar way. And now as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground. He heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But get up, enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he was out without sight. He neither ate nor drank. Keep in mind, Saul didn't ask for this. This is a complete surprise. Saul was not a seeker. He didn't go buy a latte and decide to sit in the back of a seeker-friendly church and check it out. He was a zealot opponent who encountered the living Christ, and his life was changed forever. For all of our digging and scratching and asking and questioning, don't forget that our conversion does not happen on the day we find God, but on the day the relentless, tenacious, loving God gets hold of us. Poet Francis Thompson refers to God as the hound of heaven, unwearied by the chase. God is seeking to find you so that your life might be changed by the pure love of Christ. It has been 20 years ago now that I went to work at the McAfee School of Theology. My first job at the seminary, I was admissions director. I was the one where everybody sent all of their application materials to be entered into seminary. Once a file was complete with all the transcripts and all the essays and all the letters of recommendation, I sat and made judgment on those files. Some of them I would stamp accepted pretty easily. I never stamped decline on my own. I always took that one to a committee. But over the course of my 9 years as admissions director, I read hundreds of admission essays. Some of them were spiritually moving, some of them were heart-wrenching. Some of them made it easier to put it in the stack that says, "Take this to the committee for review." I just looked, you got to be kidding. But I read an unusual number of essays about the spiritual journey that began like this. Unlike the Apostle Paul, my Christian journey did not begin with a Damascus Road experience. And then the essay would go on to follow a kind of apologetic arc. They said, I just grew up in a Christian home and was loved and taken to church, and then heard the story of Christ's love, and I just, said yes and got baptized. Like apologetic. Like it'd have been better if they'd been in a gang that vandalized Baptist children's homes or something. Then they'd have a good conversion story. There's a peculiar thing going on the placement of this story in the book of Acts. I don't know if you noticed, but we're moving through Acts in order. And the first half of Acts is about the early church, mostly around Jerusalem. The second half of Acts is about Paul and the missionary journeys. But the conversion of Saul is in chapter 9. The rest of his story is much later. We get past this story of his conversion, and then we have stories about Peter. So is this a misplaced biography? I don't think so. I think the story is here because it's told in the context of other conversion stories. Remember last week, we talked about the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch, and that story came out right after the conversion of some Samaritans. And if you'll remember from last week's sermon, the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch was completely different from Saul's story. Nothing like as dramatic as this one. The Ethiopian eunuch is reading and writing. He's asking. He fell into conversation with Philip. He asks a few more questions. He looks at the scripture. Finally, he says, "What's to hinder me from being baptized?" Low key. God reaches into the eunuch's life through scripture and conversation. Very different from the story of Paul. Flannery O'Connor famously said of Paul, "I reckon the Lord knew that the only way to make a Christian out of that one was to knock him off his horse." Scripture and conversation over here. Next story, knocked down and made blind. God comes to us in different ways. Don't wish for a different story. Paul's encounter is not normative, or is it better? God reaches us in so many different ways, and most of our conversion stories are nothing like as dramatic as Paul's. But the issue is not the fireworks at conversion, but our commitment to the way. C.S. Lewis is arguably the most important Christian apologist of the last century. And he told his conversion story in one of his books, the great moment of spiritual insight for him, the aha moment. In the story, he said he was riding in a sidecar on the way to the Whipsnade Zoo in 1931. Now picture that. You got one of the motorcycles and one of the little sidecars. For some reason, I can only picture C.S. Lewis wearing a tweed suit with elbow patches. Even to the zoo, I don't know why. But he's in the sidecar, headed to the zoo, and this is what he writes of that moment. "When we set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And when we reached the zoo, I did." As conversion stories go, that's not real dramatic. But his commitment to the way, quite dramatic. C.S. Lewis's story is not filled at all with drama, but it is filled with surprise. In fact, he titled that book, that story of his early days, the autobiography of his early life, Surprised by Joy. God reaches into our mundane living and jolts and surprises. It's not important for you to have had a dramatic conversion, but if God never surprises you, never jolts you into something new, that may be a different thing. God is alive and still seeking us with surprising, unexpected expressions of love. Theologian Robert Jensen said, "That's how you can tell the difference between a true living God and a dead false God. A fake, non-interventionist God will never surprise you." I don't know how God is working in your life, but I do know that the relentless God is searching for you. You may right now be dealing with a really profound sense of the holy. So overwhelmed by the power of God's love that you feel struck blind by the sheer force of God's reach into your life. And if that's so, we want to celebrate that. We need to hear your story. You might be, though, like the Ethiopian traveler. You've read and studied and asked and befriended so long that you're now starting to see windows open, windows of surprise, and you're starting to see glimpses of what the abundant life looks like. You might have been a Christian a long time, but the relentless hound of heaven has found you again, this time surprising you by calling you into a new form of service, a new kind of giving, a new expression of your giftedness. The question's not how dramatic was your conversion. The question is, how serious is your commitment to the way? How committed are you to a particular way of living that distinguishes your commitment to the Christ? And whether or not you will say yes, whenever and wherever the surprise of God catches you. If God is whispering now some surprising word, whether you've got it sorted out or not, share it so the rest of us can pray and celebrate with you. However you hear God, respond as we stand and sing.